the gap between certain specs because of basically nepotism. Yeah. The difference is nepotism. It's being born into a rich family. In this case, the family of Elemental is a shit-ass, poor hobo family that brings nothing to the company, while Demo was born with a silver spoon in their hand in the shape of a Hellstone that they can give to others, and others like that, so they are brought to the company meetings. Today, on this black and white edition of our Raiding Meta recap, you might think of this day as being 3 days away from Christmas. I remember this day as the 138th anniversary of the election of Ito Hirobumi as the first ever Prime Minister of Japan. Also cool and relevant that he was also a samurai, the last samurai to be the Prime Minister of Japan. Talking about being the top dog in a country, in this case the country of raid players, today we have our update on how things have been going in the raid. We have our plenty different things we can look at when talking about the performance of the specs in the raid, starting with, of course, the DPS. We have our cool, newly released now Archon site from Warcraft Logs, giving us even more things to check out on when talking about the performance of the specs in the raid. What's always cool about these type of sites is when you compare them against each other to find all of the differences. For example, according to Warcraft Logs, Subtlety should be doing 211,000 average DPS on all bosses, but then you go to u.gg and Subtlety is supposed to be doing 227,000, and then you go back to Archon and Subtlety is supposed to be doing 248,000. So which one are we even following right now? We can just make the average, see how things are going across all the different sites reporting on the performance of the specs. What is relevant about the performance of the specs this week? Perhaps not today, because it's Friday, it's still very early, but later down this week, we have to mention that in this week we have gotten the balance tuning going live, likely the last balance tuning of this year, where we have gotten, for example, a 3% buff to the damage of RANT. We've also gotten a nerf to Havoc, while getting a buff to Shadow Priest, a significant 7 to 8% single target and even 10-11% AoE buff given to Windwalker. All 3 mage specs were being buffed. For example, Devastation Evoker was also buffed, especially in AoE. So these are types of buffs that might be noticeable as we go deeper down this week. For now, they might not be fully visible yet. However, we do continue to see some familiar results as we continue another week to have the triple rogue right up at the top of the performance. Of course, once you split this performance, you see that, for example, now Outlaw is nowhere near as high. If you change, Outlaw is also nowhere near as high, and now even Subtlety is also nowhere near as high. If you go here and you move away from the throughput and you actually look at the popularity overall, you have both Outlaw and Subtlety at the bottom, even though if you look at their damage is top tier. The same discussion one-to-one can be said to marksmanship. We see marksmanship here blasting strongest ranged DPS in the raid, and then you go down into the tier list and marksmanship is dead last, and then marksmanship is dead last, and then marksmanship from throughput to popularity is also dead last. So there are some differences between how much damage are you doing versus how popular you are and how brought to the raid you are in terms of your popularity. The gap from Beast Mastery all the way down to marksmanship is very visible. Not nearly as big for rogues. Rogues are much closer to each other. They show they are being brought way more evenly compared to the massive difference between hunters. We have, though, touched on this already. Looking at the all bosses damage can be quite misleading. As you look at this, you might think there is a slight advantage for melee DPS in the top half of the results, because you see triple rogue, you see Havoc, you see enhancement and even Fury, but then you also see Beast Mastery, Balance, Elemental, Demo and Marksmanship, so they are actually half and half. However, you quickly realize that specs like Elemental and specs like Balance are cheating the overall results by being giant outlier, for example, on Council of Dreams, while the rest of the results are much lower down, or something like Marksmanship Hunter is doing very well on Larodar, while going on a pure single target boss like Volkoros, they are literally at the bottom, excluding Augmentation, who is broken, at the bottom of the results. That is why it might be confusing to see, oh, Marksmanship is blasting, Elemental is blasting, and then you see actual tier lists or comment from top players mentioning them or them being weak, being put into the bottom of the tier list, for example. That is why. It's because the overall damage is not representative of how powerful they currently are in the raid. Now, to be perfectly honest, the top of the results is likely to stay the same. Number one, because they are currently gapping the others by quite a bit, but more importantly, number two, because it's not that the balance tuning did anything to them in the first place. Specs like BM didn't get nerfed, specs like Demo is not getting nerfed, Augmentation has not been nerfed anymore, so it's unlikely to see any of these specs we have seen already at the top for basically the entire season go anywhere. Where it gets a bit more spicy is when you look at the bottom side, the bottom half, because, for example, across these specs, these two are both getting buffed, this one is getting buffed, this one, and these two are getting buffed, this one is getting buffed. You also have Windwalker Monk, who has received a buff. Even talking about healers, you are getting this one nerfed and this one buffed. And even in the very incoming, at this point it's very close, the very close 10.2.5 patch, you even have this one getting buffed by quite a bit as well. So that is what might be bringing more changes in terms of the state of the meta. Not as much looking at the good results in here, but more so looking at the bad results in here. Since many of the specs currently lingering at the bottom are receiving or are about to receive a good amount of buffs. We still have to point out though, even though things might get better, that this is very likely the season where we have gotten the most strict requirements for forming a raid group. We have taken a look at this before, but you can see in the progress of this tier, looking at, for example, Ferak, the last boss, which is very hard, of course, but you can still see in the compositions, in the options of the guilds for this boss, you can see how few icons you see of different specs. You know, for tanks, it's basically just 2. For healers, it's basically just 4. The others don't even show up. You know, Resto Shaman, Resto Druid are not even here. For range DPS, it's also very narrow. You want double Augmentation, double BM, 1 Warlock for Hellstones, 1 Mage for Arcane Intellect, and then nothing else. Melees are the ones that are more open. You have, you know, 2 Rogues, plus 2 Demon Hunters, plus your Enhancement Shaman, or even 2 Enhancement Shamans, because you're bringing so many melees, you might as well have 2 Enhancement Shamans for 2 Wind Fury groups, and then your Token Warrior for Battle Shout, as well as the Token Druid. Because if you're not bringing Guardian, and you're not bringing Resto Druid, and you're not bringing Balanced Druid, then you need someone to give you the Druid Mark of the Wild buff, which is now Feral. So this is very strict, you know, it's very narrow. If you go back down, for example, to the beginning of this expansion, to Vault, to something like Razaget, which was also a very difficult boss, right? You can immediately see way more options available. Perhaps not in the tank options, which are still quite narrow, just 2, but then healers are suddenly now more than we've gotten now. Range DPS are now suddenly way more than we've gotten now, and melee DPS are even more spread than we are getting right now on Ferak. So this is narrowing down the options available for you in the raid, and also create situations that might confuse players, right? Because even looking at these results, you're wondering, hold on a second, you have Beast Mastery, which is even lower down than Elemental. You have Demo at 210,000 average, which is only 8,000, only like 4% DPS ahead of Shadow Priest. Is it really a reason that every single group in the raid runs with a Warlock and nobody runs with a Shadow Priest? Obviously not. Obviously, part of the reason as to why many of these groups are assembled isn't because of this, the throughput, but more so because of this, the popularity, i.e. which specs are needed in which group. Like, for example, the Druid for Mark of the Wild, your Demo Warlock for your Hellstone and your Gateway, etc, etc. These type of things become at some point quite necessary to form your raid. Even if you went into complete imaginary territory, like for example simulations, you know, looking at what would the AI piloting a perfect rotation on each spec, how would they perform, you see that technically we should be having specs like Devastation, Frost Mage, Frost DK, Ret Paladin as the best single target DPS specs right now. But then you go back to a single target boss like Volcaros, and Ret is middle of the pack, and then you have Frost Mage, who's like the worst performer on this single target fight. You have Devastation Evoker, who is also bottom half. So it's not that these simulations are actually having a good reflection on what is actually happening in reality, in real life. This is also a big part on how guilds get to form a raid roster, and how guilds get to choose who gets to be picked a lot and who gets to be picked far, far less. It's by no means specs right here, specs below basically this half are nearly as terrible as their popularity makes it seem. It's not that Demo at the moment is about 6 times stronger than Elemental, or you know, 2-3 tiers better than Elemental. By any measured metric right now, you see Demo and Elemental, and their numbers apart are, look at this, they are like 3% ahead, 4% ahead for Demo, maybe they are not even ahead at all. So the gap between certain specs is not nearly as big because of their performance, but rather it's as big because of their spec. Because of basically nepotism. Yeah. The difference is nepotism, it's being born into a rich family. In this case, the family of Elemental is a shit-ass, poor hobo family that brings nothing to the company, while Demo was born with a silver spoon in their hand in the shape of a Hellstone that they can give to others, and others like that, so they are brought to the company meetings, whereas Elemental is in that awkward situation where they see around them people sending messages to each other and whispering about the meeting they're about to have tonight, and they haven't been invited. And at that point, it's too late and they are too awkward and embarrassed to actually ask what those guys are planning to do in the evening, so they will just sadly put their head down and take their bus home, because of course they don't have a car, they can't afford it, and spend the night at home ordering takeout food for one, sadly watching some rerun of a TV show from 17 years ago. That's the difference right now on many specs, on the reason why certain specs get to be played versus others that do not, even if they are not even that different in how powerful they are, you know, how much damage they can actually do. This entire RANT very often is the same, not just for DPS. Let's be equal here. Let's also talk about the healers, because it's more or less similar. For example, Discipline, technically speaking, are they actually gapping specs like Resto Druid or specs like Resto Shaman? Because if we go back to here and we look at the popularity, you would think that Discipline and Holy Paladin, for example, are these must-have super powerful healers, whereas nobody wants to touch Resto Shaman or Preservation Evoker or even Resto Druid. But then you go and look at the actual results, and Resto Druid and Resto Shaman are doing just fine. If anything, they're even beating them in terms of HPS. We can switch here to healers and to the throughput, and once more Resto Shaman is having no problems beating Discipline, and so is Resto Druid being even with them. The main difference is of course things like stamina. Since ranged DPS are not that popular, plus Shadow Priest is not that strong, you want to bring a healer, so you have to bring the priest. Of the two priests, Discipline is the stronger one, so you get to play Discipline. However, what is Shaman bringing to the table? Nothing, really, so you don't really have a reason to bring it. Same goes for Resto Druid. If you're bringing a Balanced Druid or a Feral Druid, why are you bringing a Resto Druid? Same for a Preservation Evoker. Meanwhile, back to Holy Paladin, the currently most popular pick in the raid, despite their performance being middling to below average, because they have been blessed for over a decade, if not almost 2 decades, with this thing called Devotion Aura. And for not nearly as much, but also this thing called Aura Mastery as a damage reduction raid cooldown. This has given them a very simple and comfy raid spot. This was made even worse when Blizzard decided to bless Paladin with a rework, now giving them 2 must-have auras in the raid, not just 1. So even if you had a Prot Paladin, even if you had a Red Paladin running Devotion aura, you would still want a second one for Retribution aura. So Paladin, despite the performance being middling to below average, is still the most brought raid healer, for example, even though the performance is not really the reason why they get to be higher than, for example, all of these specs. That is one of the bigger points to understand when talking about DPS and even healer rankings, meta, tier lists when it comes to the raid. Because in Mythic Plus, not nearly as many of these things matter. When we were talking about the Exodia composition in Mythic Plus, when we were crying about this awful situation right here of balancing, it's not that this was being brought because of the Fortitude buff being brought by a Shadow Priest and the Arcane Intellect and the Mark of the Wild and the Devotion Aura being brought by these specs. That was completely irrelevant. Nobody cared about those buffs. No group in Mythic Plus almost ever has been assembled because of a very one specific raid party buff being brought by someone else. And we're not counting, of course, augmentation, since their entire thing is giving out buffs to the rest of the party. But when it comes to the raid, this becomes much more relevant, much more valuable. So while in Mythic Plus, let's just say there might be more meritocracy, in the sense that even if, for example, you already have a Vengeance Demon Hunter and you don't really need the Havoc Demon Hunter debuff for the Chaos brand, if Havoc is OP, if the damage of Havoc is OP and broken, then yeah, you keep bringing Havoc because their damage is the best. That is not quite the same when it comes to the raid. Sometimes there are going to be specs that are reasonably interchangeable, reasonably at the same level, not something that will make or break your kill, like for example specs like Shadow Priest or specs like Balance Druid or specs like Mages could be only slightly weaker than specs like BM or specs like Havoc in the raid, but they just don't bring anything extra to the raid. No extra buff, no extra raid cooldown, raid defensive or things like that, for which they end up not being brought. But it is not fully because of their power, at least not nearly as much as when it comes to Mythic Plus, where very often the one you're bringing the most is very simply the one who is doing the most damage, and not really the one who has some special gimmick, some special feature. Unless it is something extreme, like for example, talking about extreme, the Exodia of Season 2, where Shadow Priest wasn't really out-damaging many of the other specs in Mythic Plus, but they had PI, and they had Mind Soothe, and they had Master Spell, so all of those things together ended up making them a must-have pick. But that was a very special exception in Mythic Plus that generally doesn't happen as much as it does in the raid. So even while looking at the performance of the specs right now, as well as taking in mind the possible buffs or nerfs to some of the specs, it still has value, right, to take in mind that some of these specs might be luckier or more unlucky, or more privileged or less privileged based on what are they also being brought in the raid for. If they are being brought for a raid buff, for a raid debuff, for certain positive things that they can add to the raid, their worth might be higher or lower than just getting buffed or nerfed. Like finishing with the example that Windwalker right now is at a slight disadvantage, because even if they're getting buffs, and they did get a big buff this patch, they still have to contend with the fact that at the moment Mistweaver is the third most popular, but very close to the top 2 and gapping the 4th one in terms of healers, which means you are already bringing the Monk debuff. So it's not that Windwalker comes from the comfy spot of being the only viable Monk, so you would still have a spot guaranteed. In the case of the buff of Windwalker, either the buff is strong enough to bring them to beat others, and on top of that, the others they are beating must be specs that can be removed. For example, what's the point of a Windwalker Monk starting to out-damage a Fury Warrior or an Arms Warrior when you still need to bring at least one warrior into the raid, because there are no warrior tanks, so you still need your warrior for the buff, so it doesn't matter if you keep buffing Windwalker because you will still have to bring at least one warrior. Same concept goes for example, if you're bringing a Feral Druid and then Windwalker gets buffed and starts out-damaging a Feral Druid. Doesn't matter. If you don't run Guardian and you don't run Resto or don't run Balance, you must keep Feral anyways. So Windwalker in this example would be disadvantaged because they don't just have to out-damage another spec, they also have to out-damage a spec that could be benched without the raid losing something very important. That's the unlucky part when you're talking about performance in the raid, as opposed to the lucky part, I guess, of outperforming someone in Mythic Plus. If all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Ret started out-damaging Havoc by 20% or more, Ret would be meta. Havoc would be benched for a Ret Paladin in Mythic Plus. But that wouldn't be the case in the raid, because you would still need Havoc for the magical damage debuff, because Vengeance isn't a meta raid tank, which means you must have one Havoc player and you wouldn't be benching it for Ret, even if Ret was OP. That's the thing to keep in mind when looking at these results from the raid. Not just looking at the performance, not just getting baited from what the throughput results are telling you, how much of a performance in terms of sheer numbers certain specs have, but also consider how safe, how protected the spec is in a raid comp in terms of the buff they are bringing or the debuff they are bringing in the raid compared to other specs. So this is our recap for today when it comes to the raid situation, as we wait further developments of the effects of the buffs and the nerfs from the balance tuning of this reset. Besides this, on this Friday, it's time to leave each other for today. I'm going to leave you to your incoming soon Christmas holidays. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which can, as per usual, be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, it's time to leave each other once more in the darkness. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, weird. With the window open, it's 6 degrees, but it didn't really feel that cold, actually. I'm surprised.